Welcome to another episode of Assess That with Tom and Nat.
The podcast where we talk honestly about assessment, what works, what doesn't, and what actually helps students to learn.
Each episode explores practical ideas, real classroom experiences, and the thinking behind sound assessment and grading practices.
Because when assessment is done well, it doesn't just measure learning, it shapes it.
Sure does. All right. As we do.
As we must.
As we must. Let's check in. And I've come up with a big one today.
Okay.
Sometimes these are light, like what's your favorite food? Or what do you like to eat?
Yeah.
Or This one's, I think, this is a big one. If you were teaching a class on life, like a life class,
okay,
what would lesson number one be?
So not like career and life management.
No, like life, like living life. Like this is like the meaning of life, if you will.
Yeah.
It's what would lesson number one be in your class on life?
Don't believe everything you think.
Yeah.
That would be it. My life is pretty much transformed once I came to understand that.
Say more about that.
Say more. All right, Brene. Love that. Well, when I had it was a nervous breakdown in December of 2021, and I had to go to emergency therapy. This was the first battle I had with my therapist, which led me to swear at her. Sorry, Ray-Jan. Not proud of that moment. Because I thought when she was trying to explain all the research and the truth behind this, she was basically shaming me for feeling like distress, for feeling anxiety, for feeling panic. And I think I yelled, "Don't effing tell me to choose happy." Because we had gone through a bunch of like Stephen Covey, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People training. And it has a pretty shamey messaging because they don't explain. I'm a very I need to know the research. I need to know what empirically is making this true and not just your opinion and I should believe you. And so she broke down the research. I think it's Weinberg's attribution theory.
Yeah.
And it's this idea that I always believed we felt something, like emotions just flooded our body and then we'd think things about it. And so if I could stop the emotion, I'd stop the thoughts. But it's the complete opposite. Our thoughts are happening so fast and so instantaneously, and it's causing the emotions that are then impacting our actions and behaviors. So if you're feeling anxious, if you're feeling distressed, if you're feeling angry, you disrupt that by changing your thoughts. And once you know that, you can change pretty much everything about your life because all the habits and all the actions you're wishing you'd take and you're wishing you'd build come from the thoughts you have. Yeah. And then the feelings you can cultivate, and those feelings motivate the actions. And that literally has changed my life. It's allowed me to go from being a full-time employee of a small district or independent school in Calgary and transition into speaking, consulting, growing a business, leaving a long-term relationship, meeting a new partner, Tom, traveling the world, doing everything I used to think was absolutely impossible because I unlocked this truth about life.
Yeah,
so it's a pretty big one.
That one I learned from Wayne Dyer. I remember listening to him, and I've got another one from him that is really a big life lesson that I've learned. But that don't believe everything you think. Just because you think it doesn't make you right. It's an interesting part where we know nobody is right about everything, except we think we're right about everything. Yeah. Right? We think everything we think is the absolute truth.
Yeah.
And yet, when you zoom out, you realize that it's not. No. The other piece for me is the first lesson for me would be, in addition to that one, would be not perseverating on the worst case scenario constantly.
Very similar.
So it's a very similar one, but there's a story that Wayne Dyer tells about, I think, and I'm paraphrasing here, so forgive me, but it's a story about one of his managers or one of his agents or things like that. And he had a really interesting expression. He said, I've lived a lot of trials and tribulations and dramatic events through the course of my life, most of which have never happened. Because he lived them in his mind, right? And so what happens to us is I think under the idea of appearing smart, and insightful, we want to make sure everyone knows that we know what the worst case possible scenario is. And so we end up fixating on that to a point where that's all we ever think about. The worst case scenario rarely happens. Does it happen to some individuals? Sure. Of course, there's always exceptions. But in most people's lives, I'd be willing to wager that the worst case scenario almost never happens to people. And yet how much of our energy is spent thinking about that. And that ties into what you were talking about, which is now you start thinking about the worst case scenario. What is that going to do to your emotions and all of those things? So the idea of just constantly, so perseverating on it. So I've often thought, since I've learned that, I've often given the advice when asked, spend 50% of your energy. Like, understand, be prepared for the worst case scenario, but spend 50% of your energy thinking about the best case scenario and the possibility that might happen. So I think it'd be a pretty good class on life.
I think we
Not
would
that we
slay
have,
a class on life.
Yeah, we're slaying life. Everybody's
Do
like,
people
"Oh,
still
who are
say
you? I don't
slay?
want your life." I mean, we all live our lives the way we want to live them, and therefore we think we're slaying it. But it'd be an interesting class to talk about all of that stuff. All right,
I love it. Okay, well, here are some PD events that you can look forward to next school year. Maybe we'll weave in a couple life lessons. Who knows? September 15th to 17th, Tom is going to be one of the main speakers and workshop hosts at the Assessment Collaborative Institute, which is happening in Scottsdale, Arizona, which is really fun if you've never been there. Got to go to Old Town.
Love Scottsdale.
September 25th, Tom and our teammate here at Canadian Assessment Center, Danielle Poliposki, are going to be leading a one-day workshop here in Vancouver called A Pivotal Moment, AI, Evidence, and the Future of Assessment. Your girl will probably be there too, handing out some name tags and working from the front table, but super excited about that one. Such a timely topic. Really looking forward to it. This one really came out of people asking for it, which is always the best reason to host something. September 28th to 29th, Tom is going to be hosting a 2-day workshop around his best-selling book, Grading from the Inside Out. And that's happening in Des Moines, Iowa, if you want to come there. And April 8th and 9th, we are both, plus all of our incredible team at the Canadian Assessment Center, going to be hosting our second inaugural Canadian Assessment Center Spring Conference. And this one's going down on the east side of the country, so Ottawa in Ontario. So links are in the show notes for all those events. And as well, if you want to stay in the know about these events or anything else we have going on, we actually have a really exciting opportunity to join our team right now on this email list. So if that interests you, you'll definitely want to click the link in the show notes to join our CAC email list and stay up to date on all things.
All things, for sure. Big welcome back to returning listeners and a big welcome to any new listeners joining us for the first time. We appreciate all of you.
Today, we're tackling a skill that schools talk about all the time, but may not teach as intentionally as we think: self-assessment. We often ask students to reflect on their work, use success criteria, and take ownership of their learning, but we've come to believe that recognizing quality is far more complex than many of us realize.
Right. So in this episode, we're exploring why success criteria alone might not be enough, what evaluative judgment really is, and why exemplars and calibration matter so much. So if you've ever wondered why students struggle to use feedback, revise effectively, or accurately assess their own learning, this conversation is definitely for you.
So that's today's plan. Let's get to it.
Okay, so self-assessment has become one of the most widely embraced ideas in education. We want students to reflect on their learning. We want them to understand expectations. We want them to monitor their progress and ultimately become more independent learners.
And honestly, that's a good thing. Most teachers who use self-assessment strategies are doing so because they genuinely want students to become more aware of their learning and more invested in the process.
The instinct is absolutely right. In fact, for the last couple of decades, we've been trying to move students from being passive recipients to grades, passive recipients to their learning, to active participants in that entire learning process.
But I think what we've come to realize is that recognizing quality is much harder than we sometimes assume. And that might be the heart of this entire conversation.
Exactly, because this isn't an episode about why self-assessment is a bad idea. It's not. It's an episode about why self-assessment may be a much more sophisticated skill than many of us realize. So, this idea of self-assessment has, it's been around for a very long time. When Cassandra, Nicole, and I wrote Essential Assessment, we really talked about student investment being a first among equals, right? It really is the ultimate end goal, is to teach students how to do this for themselves. So we need to have our assessment expertise so we can relay that to them. Prior, in years past, assessment was always seen as something that was done to students, not done with students, right? So students would complete the work, the teachers would evaluate the work, and then we would, report the results there. And so then, in the research, we started to see more and more emerge about what would happen if students were inside this process. I remember learning from Rick Stiggins in 2004, 2005, in the very early stages of my learning around assessment, this concept that whoever does the assessing does the learning. Like, that was something he said, it's got to be, whether it was the spring of 04 or spring of 05, I was down in Portland, I was at the conference, And I heard Rick say that, and I've never lost sight of that one. The person who does the assessing does the learning.
That's
And
huge.
so, and he went on to say that means when the assessment system is so teacher-centered, we learn a tremendous amount about the students that they don't know about themselves, because we're the ones at the center of the assessment experience. So over time, what we started to see in the research was researchers asking questions like, what if the students started to understand the learning targets more clearly? Or what would happen if students could monitor their own progress as they move forward? Or and this was what Rick talked a lot about, was how do we make students partners in this process of learning, assessment? Like, how do we bring them inside? And I think this is the part that some people misunderstand, which is self-assessment is like a zero-sum game. The more the students are involved in the assessment process, the more the teacher just backs away. When in fact, it's like a partnership. How do we bring them into it? We, of course, have the expertise and the ability to determine whether their self-assessment assertions are accurate, but bring them inside that process. So what would happen if we were able to do that? So, the move toward self-assessment is really sound educational thinking, because again, whoever does the assessment does the learning. But and I don't know many educators who would argue with that point, right? Like we all know that that's possible. We all want kids to become more self-aware and more self-reflective as learners.
No, and I think it's something that every teacher knows and is consciously aware of. And I think in their own way, they're making a lot of moves to embrace this. I don't know if everyone understands to the depth of what Rick Stiggins says around those who are doing the thing, like assessing or doing the learning, which is such a key takeaway. But I think many are doing reflection sheets, right? They finish a project, they finish a unit, they have student reflection, or at the end of an activity, they're doing exit slips at the end of class as a way to be like reflecting back on the class. They're perhaps pulling in some elements of goal setting related to the task at hand or the criteria. They are embracing student conferencing. And I think these are becoming more and more and more common. When I was in my assessment leadership role, we actually did a ton of listening as we were building the direction with what we wanted to do. And the number one thing teachers all said that they know is valuable, they're dabbling in, but they want more support with, was like student self-assessment, student ownership over that process. And I think what's so tricky is everything's so interconnected. So if you really want student investment, you need really good assessment architecture. You need really good system design. And not everybody has that. And so they're focused on this thing of like, well, I want students to take ownership, but I haven't taken ownership of creating a system for them to have ownership over. And so it's like they're often in this like catch-22. But I would say everyone's doing it at some degree, knows it's valuable, sees a hope in what it could offer for their classrooms. And I think most teachers would say like, yes, I want my students thinking about learning, and I want them understanding where they're at, what's coming next, so that they have just as much, if not more, ownership than I am having over this process.
Yeah, the tension is real. You think about the first thing that we always cut is self-reflection or self-assessment, or it's, for the sake of efficiency, we might lose some of the effectiveness. Listeners, you can think to yourself, like, how often students complete reflection activities? How often do you introduce reflection activities and self-assessment kinds of experiences for them, right? And then from that, we ask, to what degree are they accurate in terms of how they've accurately judged their own work? And there may be a little bit of a gap between the way that they invest in the reflection activity or the self-assessment activity and the accuracy or their evaluative judgment. So reflecting is not the same thing as evaluating. And I can reflect on my learning, but I may not be able to judge quality, right? So a student can complete a reflection sheet without necessarily becoming better at recognizing the quality of evidence that they themselves have produced.
That's a really, really key point that I think we have to lean into a little bit. Because, and I'm owning this as someone who struggled with it for years as a teacher in the humanities, so English and social studies, I often didn't know what quality truly looked like outside of what is the successful completion of this task. And often it would be very simplified. So social studies was one that took me a long time to find my way into. My background was literature. And I'm sure other teachers have been here where it's not real, like, you're a math teacher, so they throw you into science and you're like, ugh. So you're like, do you have 4 points in your answers? Do you have 4 key points? Do you have appropriate grammar? And what we're actually trying to get at is the quality of the thinking.
Right.
And if we could just spend so much more time there in education, like having deep conversations about the thinking, this actually feels very connected to our opening life lessons that we talked
I suppose,
about, right? Like understanding the qualities of thoughts. Because if you can understand like, oh, well, that's really all or nothing thinking and that's really problematic, or this is like, that's how you start to change your entire trajectory in life and mental health. But it's the same in school. There's different kinds of thinking. Is this critical thinking? Is it application?
Yeah.
Is it creative thinking?
Mm-hmm.
You know, what's the quality of great critical thinking versus like fallacy-laden critical thinking? Like, and so eventually, it was like about 5 years in, I started thinking about this and studying it more. Ironically, this is when the kids leaned in the most.
Yeah.
Like they were doing okay. I wouldn't say they were super invested in my social studies classes. I brought a lot of personality and energy and relationship building, but they weren't really invested in the actual learning. But when I started bringing, kids love this stuff. Yeah. We learned logical fallacies, and when they could start to notice and name them and catch themselves within it, it was like, oh, that was a straw man. It became a little much at times. I was like, you guys got to chill.
They're trying to straw man everything.
Oh, yeah. They're just like, that's a slippery slope if I've ever heard one, right? But it's like, but then they're noticing it in themselves and being able to confidently be like, oh, wow, that's a really interesting perspective. I never considered that I'm falling into this type of thinking or that, or I'm not considering this perspective. And they leaned in more because I think students are really, really, they are very motivated by challenge. I think we all are. I don't think this is a student thing. I think we are all motivated by challenge and stepping into a space that really is going to help us to grow and bring us to a reality that we're seeking. And if we can't determine qualities of thinking, we'll never quite get there. The big takeaway here is this doesn't necessarily mean that they're just answering, was my work good? Yeah. How good is it? You know, what specifically makes it strong? Does it, and without giving them any guidance on like, because they're going to talk about the surface level things that I used to look at, like how many sentences is it? That they love that one.
Yeah.
I wrote 8 sentences.
That's right.
It's like
4 pages.
Wow. And it's like much ado about nothing at the same time. Fair. So the key point is we've sometimes confused participation in self-assessment with the development of self-assessment.
Right. You can do self-assessment without understanding how to self-assess for sure. So, you know, the whole goal around self-assessment has not been wrong. Like this is a really good place for teachers in the profession to go. To me, it is the ultimate goal of developing our expertise. But I think the issue that a lot of us face in education around self-assessment is I think we've kind of underestimated the complexity of being able to self-assess. I think we just sort of like change papers and give each other feedback. Now, well-intentioned, but we really have underestimated the complexity of the skill because everything around self-assessment is connected to feedback, revision, metacognition. It's connected to their levels of independence, which tell us how secure, and we've talked about this before in the podcast, independence is not a level of proficiency, but it tells us the degree to which the evidence is secure. So evaluative judgment, you know, how do I evaluate the quality of what I've produced is likely more complex than we once believed. So the issue is not that we shouldn't be doing self-assessment. Of course we should, but it might be undertaught and underestimated in terms of a skill that we have to develop in our classrooms.
Okay, Tom. So I'm going to shift direction just a little bit here. But if self-assessment is more complicated than we originally thought, and hopefully if you're listening, maybe you're having that aha moment too. What exactly, as someone who's written books on this topic and studied this topic and read tons of the research, what exactly have we been missing? And why do students struggle to accurately assess themselves even when the success criteria are posted clearly? I'd love to throw this to you because you literally recently published an entire book called Student Self-Investment. Right.
And I think it's the level of intentionality that has not gone alongside of the work. I think we make a lot of assumptions. We are very well intentioned, but we make a lot of assumptions that students can recognize quality because using a rubric or criteria is going to require a student to make an indirect scoring inference about their work. They have to be able to infer that my demonstration of learning matches this description in the rubric.
Without simply counting.
Without simply counting. And so if we haven't been intentional about this is why I'm a huge advocate for teaching rubrics through exemplars, because it does two things. The exemplars are a very safe way because no one's in the room, right? We have an example from last year, 2 years ago, that we as a class are going to critique. So on the one hand, it starts to help kids make those inferences, and it teaches them how to critique a demonstration of learning without it being their own. So you're actually planting the seeds for how to learn how to self-assess, because when I'm looking at someone else's an example, I have to critique it through the lens of the criteria, and now I have to be able to look at it and say, what's next for that learner? So a question a teacher might ask is, if this were a student in our classroom, what would be next for them, or what level is, depending if the purpose was formative or summative.
This feels like a great place to remind them of one of our absolute favorite activities, which we do to launch a rubric.
Yeah.
And it's around a rubric calibration exercise, which is, it's easier to do than ever before with generative AI, whether it's Claude or ChatGPT. But you can absolutely do this with examples of student work that you have just in your files. But once you have your rubric, say it's 4 levels, this is the powerhouse prompt you're going to want to pause and you're going to write down. You feed that rubric into your generative AI of choice and you say, create 4 exemplars of student work according to this criteria at varying levels of quality. And the key thing here, this is so critical, I've forgotten this and it's burned me in the past, ensuring each exemplar speaks to every single criterion on the rubric. So you want it to be a holistic demonstration of this rubric with different levels of quality. Now, what you're going to get back is ChatGPT or Claude's interpretation of, here's what I think a 4 is, here's what I think a 3 is, here's what I think a 2 is, with an example of it. Yeah. And it's going to unpack it for you. Yeah. Now, the unpack is great, but don't keep that. What you just want is the example, and you give it to teams of students. And this is one of the most powerhouse activities you can do. And you give them one at a time. And you say, okay, as a team, we've just read this rubric. What is it according to these criteria? And I want you to come to best attempt at consensus as a team. Yeah. Then they share out. And then you actually calibrate with each of the teams. You coach if you need to. You ask follow-up questions. But the goal is by the 4th exemplar, through all that dialogue that's going on around them, you have calibrated the interpretation of those criteria. So that when people hear inferences, they're like, well, it's so subjective. It is if we never calibrate, if we never talk about it and say, well, here's evidence, or let's all come to some understanding as a group. And so they need to know at the beginning, the goal is that by the end of the 4 exemplars, we are pretty tight. My interpretation as the teacher is similar to your interpretation as students. You're aligned with each other. You can have some back pocket extra exemplars if you need a little bit more time, but it's one of the most powerhouse ways to do it. And it's so simple to prep for. Yeah.
And I have been recently, wink, wink, tongue in cheek, demanding teachers stop using the word subjective. I am so tired of it because subjectivity appears in the absence of expertise and experience. You know what's subjective? What's your favorite rock band? That's subjective. It's just an opinion. Yeah. What we do in education when we're assessing student work is we're not forming an opinion, like pulling it out of thin air. Like you have criteria established, right?
And you are an expert.
And you have expertise and experience, right? So if a brand new teacher doesn't have that, then that's why they need their veteran colleagues to help them calibrate on that criteria. So I think it's a really great exercise to get them practicing. That's why I've in recent years, and I'd probably say the last maybe 5 to even 10 years, but at least the last 5 to 7 years, I've been saying rubrics are teaching tools that we use for assessment. Because you're teaching criteria. So I think that's a really, really big part of it. So as we think about moving into this area of self-assessment, there are some challenges. We as a profession are right to keep pushing forward on this self-assessment thing, and we have to not give up on it so quickly. But again, as I mentioned earlier, I think we've kind of underestimated how difficult it is to learn how to recognize quality. And even some teachers early in their career really struggle with this. So we have to help our students understand it as well.
Absolutely. And I think one of the biggest assumptions that we make in education is that if students can repeat the success criteria, if they've memorized them, that they understand quality.
Exactly.
Right?
We hand the students a rubric, we post the criteria up on the bulletin board, or we show it on the screen. We discuss the learning target. We say, this is what we're learning today. And then we just assume we're all seeing the same thing.
Exactly. But students can often recite the language without really understanding what it looks like in practice. Math teachers, you know this is true.
Exactly.
Little math robots in there.
The students can tell us to I need to use evidence, right? I need to explain my thinking.
With 8 sentences.
Right. But that does not necessarily mean they can recognize what strong evidence or sophisticated reasoning is when they see it.
Yeah, and I think that's where a lot of frustration comes from.
Yeah.
For teachers, for sure, but also for students. It doesn't feel good to feel like you're just trying to regurgitate what someone wants without really understanding what that means.
Yeah. I do think the underestimation of this skill is in the fact that teachers have so much experience in looking at student samples.
Mm.
If you're anywhere into your career, you've probably looked at thousands of student samples, right? So we kind of almost have an expert blind spot in the sense that we think it's so easy to see quality because we have that expertise and we can almost spot it instantly, right? Show 2 writing samples, 2 math explanations, 2 science conclusions. And as teachers, most of us can immediately start making the distinction and the judgment between the two. And often we can't even articulate how quickly we're doing it. Like it's such a part of our expertise and such a part of what we do that it almost has become an instinct for some teachers that we kind of underestimate how long it took us to develop this skill, right? So if you take 2 grade 5 persuasive paragraphs and within 10 seconds, I'll know which one is stronger. Like just like that, right? We as teachers have this mental library. Our experience is really sort of keeps, every time we examine student learning, it loads something into that mental library, right? The students don't have that, right? So what feels so obvious to us as teachers is not obvious to our students at all.
Yeah, I was fortunate enough years ago to do a series of leadership training with Dr. David Townsend from out of the University of Lethbridge, and he introduced this phrase to us that I've never forgot. He said, one of the hardest things with leading when you're trying, and I believe every teacher is a leader, full stop, even if you don't have the official capital L title and you're leading your classroom, is to try to help others and yourself even, because you have to do this for yourself first before you can help others. He says it's the move from unconscious competence to conscious competence.
Yeah.
It's one of the hardest things to navigate in the space. And I think that's exactly what self-assessment is trying to do. Yeah. And we have to be able to do it ourselves first. So how do I deeply articulate that intuition that I have from having looked at thousands? Because this is something you and I have dealt with in so many workshops where we're trying to help teachers build their assessment architecture and their assessment system. And they go, I already know this stuff.
Yeah.
We go, but we need it to be overt and conscious and understandable for students to build. Like first we need to build their competence, and then building conscious competence is where you really have ownership. That's where and I mean, most teachers know this when we'll say, what truly is, exemplary? What does that mean to you? And almost every teacher I talk to will say something along the lines of, you can teach it to others. You don't get there until you have conscious competence. Because if it's unconscious, it feels impossible, even if you're doing it well. And a lot of students end up in this place where they're learning the content, they're doing everything, but if you really ask them to describe how this works, hey, you got all your math questions correct. Why are those the correct answer? And if they can't tell you, they haven't developed conscious competence yet. So I had to take, that was a little diversion, but I think it's such an important concept in just leadership and teaching and assessment. But the key is we're really trying to build from the students' perspective here. So we do it ourselves so we can help them do it, but they often believe they've met the criteria.
Right.
They do. They don't always believe, they're not always being careless. They're not always ignoring feedback. Sometimes they genuinely just see their work differently, right? Because there isn't the same consciousness that we have about it. So as an example, a student would read I've been using this, I'm just going to double tap on it for the third time. From their perspective, it's add more detail. So they're like, okay, they add 5 more sentences.
Yeah. They make it longer.
Yeah, they make it longer. And this happens all the time. So they don't have conscious competence over the idea of what detailed or specificity really means. So they're like, And so the key point here is that students and teachers are often looking at the same work through different lenses because of that consciousness. So the issue isn't always effort. Sometimes it truly is just perception.
Yeah. And we have to be able to teach the criteria, because so much of our criteria, if you look at rubrics, often they are too cryptic on their own.
Mm-hmm.
They will say things like, it's effective, it's thorough, it's insightful, it's well-developed. But often the question gets asked, like, what do those words actually mean? And I will get that question from teachers, like, how are students supposed to know what thorough means? I've had that occasionally in a workshop. Well, the answer is you have to teach them, right? You have to teach.
It feels a little like facetious.
Yeah,
but
it sounds no, and it's not. Look, it comes up, right? It's
does,
like part of it, and sometimes the answer is the most obvious answer, which is no one's going to know anything until you teach them. So when it says something like thorough, insightful, logical conclusions, insightful conclusions, whatever it is, that's why we have to teach them, right? So we have to internalize them and think to ourselves, what does that mean, and how am I going to help my learners understand that? Because we have to remind ourselves that rubrics are not answer keys and they are not checklists. They are not going to articulate every possible iteration of how the student is going to show what they know. They're going to show what they know, and the rubric describes quality, as I often like to emphasize that syllable, describes quality. And so being able to make the inference, it describes quality without necessarily being prescriptive. So being able to explain what the words mean in a rubric is really critical. So success criteria is really about describing quality, but it's not the explanations. The explanations come from the teaching, come from the exemplars. The explanations come through all of that work.
I feel like this connects back to confidence. Does that click for you?
Yeah, for sure.
This is probably the Dunning-Kruger effect at play, right? But some students can be extremely confident about weak work, and others are highly critical of excellent work.
Yeah.
And I think in there is more of an emotional evaluation than like a really grounded, evidence-based evaluation. And I think there's so much in here that we have to help students negotiate around the habits of thinking that they're approaching to their self-assessment, that they're putting on their self-assessment. So am I a perfectionist? Well, we have to address that as a part of the process. Am I grossly overconfident in the absence of any kind of evidence? Well, we have to address that. Am I really just looking at like effort instead of my true achievement of what I've done? Well, we have to address that. And I think confidence and accuracy are not the same thing. A student's confidence level doesn't actually tell us whether they can accurately judge quality.
Yeah. I mean, I think you think about when you have training and expertise, if you're an expert musician, for example, you're going to hear things most people don't hear when you're listening to music, right? You're going to watch, a coach is going to watch an athlete, and they're going to see technical mistakes that are kind of invisible to the spectators, right? Or, the other night, when my friends were over before we were going out for dinner, we were having wine, and I think I have a good palate for wine, but I don't taste all of the notes and the characteristics that, say, a sommelier or someone who has an expertise in, right? So expertise changes what you notice. And that's why teachers and students see different things. Like the teacher has the expertise. They're going to see things that the students may not see. And that's why we have to help the students become more expert, because the more expertise the students develop, the more that expertise comes out in them. Because if you have that expertise, it's kind of invisible to everyone else. So we have to bring them inside that process.
I think another perspective we have to also hold space for here is that students we want them to build expertise, but in many cases they are novices. And it's almost like they're building expertise in their novice journey into this space. So we have to be careful of not expecting them to think completely like experts. For instance, we wouldn't expect someone to identify high quality jazz after hearing one song.
No.
Wine after having one glass, right? Like it all kind of tastes the same, except for I feel like, what's that one really, like Gato Negro that my I think everyone can agree that one's not very good, or Baby Duck. But I think that's an important thing I just wanted to drop in here. And I don't know if you disagree, Tom.
No,
but
I agree.
Let me be so careful here when I say this. I'm not saying that we say, well, they can't judge quality because, they're just all these poor babies. It's hard for them and it's easier to let them count things. We're not suggesting that, right? We're suggesting just that when we present exemplars or when we discuss what quality looks like, we're not pulling from the greatest in the field to say you have to produce that. We can learn from mentor texts.
Right.
Love a good mentor text, but it's not the expectation that a grade 7 writer creating a paragraph is going to write like the greatest novelists of all time.
Yeah. No, and this is why rubrics still matter, success criteria still matters, but students can know the words that are in the rubric without understanding the quality behind the words, right?
Mm-hmm.
So as I said earlier, a rubric is a teaching tool, but it's not a teaching strategy. We have to develop a more extensive way to get kids to interact with it, so that we can ultimately move them into a place where they can recognize quality.
Absolutely. So, Tom, if criteria aren't enough, how do people actually learn? Like, we've talked about this a bit, but I think I want to go a bit deeper, if that's okay. How do people actually learn to develop and recognize quality? And I guess that is the question we've been asking all along, and I'm just going to say it overtly.
Yeah.
But I'd love to throw it to you.
Well, how do you recognize quality? Ultimately, this is about practice, and it's recognizing quality in your own work and being able to connect between descriptors and being able to recognize quality in that sense. So success criteria is where it starts. It starts with the rubric, being clear about what the expectations are, but we have to understand how evaluation or evaluative judgment works in the first place so I can evaluate the quality of what I'm producing. You can know the language long before you can see the nuances. And so once I know the language of the rubric, it really comes down to practice, conversation, and calibration in how we develop that. So like you said, success criteria aren't enough. And we really should ask that question. How do people actually learn to recognize quality?
Yeah, and I want to double tap on a really important concept that you just added into the conversation, and I want to say it explicitly for people so there's some conscious competence, but it's evaluative judgment.
Yeah.
What is that?
Well, it's simply the ability to determine the quality of your own work, right? Or the quality of work, whether it's your own or someone else's. And the more we think about it, the more we believe that this is actually one of the most important skills we can help students develop.
Yeah. Any expert in any field is sought after for their evaluative judgment.
Right.
I want to take my script I'm writing as a budding script writer to Steven Spielberg.
Yeah.
What do you think? Right? Like that's the first thing you would do. Like what an incredible skill to develop, and what a gift that we have that ability as educators. How many teachers have had students come back years later and be like, I'm building something and I'd love to know what you think. They're asking for your evaluative judgment.
Exactly.
Exactly. Incredible. And so to show them that they have that capacity too, that they have that type of voice and that type of impact, I think is really, really, really special, because once students can accurately recognize quality, so many other things become possible. Feedback becomes more meaningful, revision becomes more purposeful, independence becomes even more realistic, because you actually want more time with your own thinking and reflection to go, I'm not ready, Steven Spielberg. I got to work on this.
Right.
But then I'm going to really want to hear from you too, because I'm at a place where I've made some very explicit calls and decisions, and I want to notice if you notice them, if you can name them, or if maybe you're like, that was stupid. And then I'm like, okay, duly noted. Got it.
Yeah, but this ability doesn't emerge automatically. It's learned. This is something that we can teach. And it's where I think this is the part that I think we've underestimated in terms of the complexity of this work. So evaluative judgment, if you will. And I know the word evaluation gets a bad rap in education, but that's ultimately what we are doing. We are evaluating the quality of what we're doing. So if listeners, you want to teach this to students, the first thing we want to do is avoid making this overly academic, right? What students need to be able to answer about their work or someone else's work is, first, is this good? Is this of good quality? But then more importantly, how is it good? Like, how is it? You're saying this is good. How is it good? And why is it good? Like, it's the question first is it? But then it gets to how and why, and ultimately what would make the work better, right? Because that is ultimately what every profession is going to rely on, which is evaluative judgment. Like whether you're a teacher, a chef, an architect, as you talked about with music or script writing, musician, you are constantly making judgments about quality.
Oh, 1,000% all day, every day, whether you're choosing a restaurant. We did that today. We spent a bit of time being like, okay, let's choose some places to experience tonight. Evaluating a presentation that you just sat through, whether it's through work or something you chose to attend, going to the mall. If a woman in Sephora, you need some freaking evaluative judgment.
Right.
Because there's like 95 different kinds of blush.
Yeah.
So how do you know what is the right blush for you? You know, that's kind of a silly example. I guess like walking into the BCL, choosing a beer, like I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, then obviously like sure, editing a piece, but that is such an important skill. And this is a genuine question I have in this space, because as we enact this competency in our life as adults, there is always an element of like understanding yourself, your values, and how that is going to impact your evaluative judgment. And I say that's values. I think it's deeper than just preference. I think that's really throwaway.
Right.
How do we hold like that? This is a huge question. I'm sorry, but I'm going to throw it to you. Where is the space, do you think, Tom, in like helping students to look at the criteria and look at what's been laid out, but also have space for their own voice of saying, not just this is what I like and, like these really shallow things, but really connecting it to who they're becoming as a person, like why I'm drawn to this versus this?
Oh, that's a big question in terms of quality.
I'm kind of putting you on the spot.
Yeah.
Okay, let me come up with, I have an example. So I always use we both use chocolate chip cookies a lot in our rubric coaching, right? Yeah. And one example, this is how I bust down this subjective myth for people. I give them this really poorly written line of criteria that's around like flavor and taste. And they're all like, oh my gosh, so subjective. How would you ever, blah, 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 blah. But the example that I often give is like, when we make it that broad, we present an opportunity for a student to make an argument about why adding spice to their chocolate chip cookies makes a lot of sense from their cultural background, where their abuela used to always add spice into hot chocolate, and it's something that's very nostalgic. So all of this is showing their value of family. Great. I said to them, if you were given that argument from a student, would you say, well, I don't like spice?
Yeah.
And give them a 1.
Yeah.
And no, never, of course, everyone says, absolutely not.
Right.
And I say, so where is the subjectivity in that? Like, that's beautiful. That's called understanding. That's called dialogue. That's called holding space to like, and so that's kind of what I'm getting at. Like, I think when we talk self-assessment, it almost feels like, and I don't have the research to support this, and I'm hoping maybe you do, it almost feels like we need to start from the student voice when we have broad criteria, which are intended to be inclusive of different experiences, perspectives, understandings, and then apply our professional judgment of that specific skill to arrive at some reasoned. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think you take out the I don't like spice because it's really not about personal preference, right? And one of the exercises that we often go through in terms of calibration is I also use an activity where people are rating sandwiches, images of sandwiches. It's like, well, I don't like that sandwich because I don't like tomatoes, but that doesn't make it a poor sandwich, right? So this comes down to the describe versus prescribe.
Yeah.
The reason that we sometimes get locked into these challenging situations because our rubrics are too prescriptive in terms of output versus descriptive in terms of quality. So you would want to describe it in a way that would allow for the widest net to meet that criteria, whether it's the teacher's preference or not, right? We have to get away from that idea that I don't like spice in my hot chocolate or my cookies, therefore it's wrong. That's prescriptive, not descriptive, right? So I think where you can really allow students to have that flexibility, because this is the part that comes up a lot. I shouldn't say a lot, like in a bunch of, I don't hear this a ton, but it does come up frequently enough where I've heard people say, Tom, I don't like rubrics because they box kids in.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Oh, for sure.
Right. So that's a rubric that is too prescriptive.
Right.
And it's prescribing the output as opposed to describing the quality. And therefore, the output is really up to the student. And that can be the variable, right? So where we kind of allow student agency, allow students somewhat autonomy or whatever you want to call it, is in how they demonstrate and meet the criteria of quality.
That makes good sense.
They make choices in all of that.
So I think a big takeaway here is it almost would be worth, and I think I have done this. I'm having a vague memory of doing this in my English class where we were talking about how we evaluate text. And I remember doing a T-chart on the board and saying there's judgment and there's preference.
Yeah.
And those are two different things. And let's write criteria of what each are because we want to avoid preference and sit in judgment. And I think that's kind of exactly what we're talking about
really
here.
Important because I could be a teacher that does not like the fantasy genre. So if somebody writes a narrative about fantasy, I'm like, I don't like fantasy.
Yeah.
Well, who cares? That's not up to, it doesn't matter if you prefer it. What matters is it meets the criteria, right? And it gives the students the agency to get in.
And on the flip side, why I did this is I was really frustrated, especially with my middle school boy readers, of being like, well, I don't like those kinds of books. Well, I don't like that, And it's like, but we're building our judgment, and judgment doesn't mean you just get to decide what you like. your preference.
Right.
Like, and I gave a ton of voice and choice, but anywho, back on track. I'm here.
Right.
Long story short, we use evaluative judgment constantly. And when you actively, consciously develop it, you're going to have a much more curated, high quality life. So this isn't just like some school skill. This is a life skill.
Yeah.
And we are asking students to do something that professionals really are spending their entire careers refining.
Right. So it really is about, again, we've seen thousands of pieces of work as students. When you read a paragraph, you're not really judging it in isolation. You're kind of thinking about all the degrees of quality that you've seen before. So a lot of times what we as teachers call judgment is often pattern recognition that's been developed over time.
Oh, absolutely. This is almost like cognitive apprenticeship.
Yeah.
Right? Because they don't have access to that internal database that we have. So we need to make our thinking visible. This is like think alouds, right?
Yeah,
like
for sure.
Being like, hey, this is how experts make judgments as they're engaged in trying to move from one place to another. So it's think alouds, comparing samples, explaining, here's exactly what I see behind why one response is stronger. And honestly, this should be the teaching. I think a lot of people see this as like, oh, I'll do that when I'm correcting a test with the class.
Yeah.
This should be your lessons.
That is the teaching. Yeah,
right?
For sure. We have to think about a really good question to ask yourself is how often do you assign work that students have to complete or learning they have to demonstrate without deeply kind of studying examples of what quality looks like, right? Writing assignments, projects, presentations, problem solving examples. A lot of times production comes before analysis.
Yes.
And so you ask students to create quality before they've had enough opportunities to understand what quality looks like.
Totally. It's like how we talk about you have to consume to create.
Right.
Right? This is like sports. So you're not going to be a perfect golfer if you've never watched an incredible golfer drive the ball.
That is correct.
Thank you. I was
drive,
oh God,
yes.
I'm going to get this wrong. Every time I bring up sports analogies, I'm like, what have you done? Stick to drama, you fool. But like a chef would never cook without tasting.
What does Gordon Ramsay always say?
Taste your food.
Taste your food.
Taste your food. Yeah, in school, we often ask students to create first, and then we say, well, here's all the things you did wrong, but too bad. Like it should be the other way around. Yeah.
And this brings up a really interesting point that I think all teachers need to remind ourselves of is that self-assessment is essentially critical thinking, right? And my degree of competence within any subject domain is going to be linked to my ability to think critically about it. So I can be a very accurate self-assessor of my writing, but I could also struggle to self-assess in mathematics. I could be a very strong critic or critique in art because I have a lot of competence in that area, but I struggle with scientific reasoning, right? So evaluative judgment isn't just like one skill, it's many skills. Students, they don't learn to self-assess once, they learn it repeatedly across different domains, and that expertise develops with their competence in that particular area. It is critical thinking, right? So,
which is what allows feedback to become useful.
Yeah.
We often are like, why aren't they using the feedback? Why aren't they using the feedback? And because we've been doing all the assessing in our head and then just being like, oh my gosh, us English teachers are the worst. Vague, ... And they're like, the hell did I do with this? We all got that one, right? Vague.
The big question mark in the paragraph or whatever.
Circle, because we're doing all the thinking inside when they should be hearing what that thinking is and learning how to apply it for themselves so they can effectively close, because they can't effectively close a gap that they don't even see.
Right. 100%. And we think feedback drives learning, but feedback doesn't drive learning by itself. Feedback will drive learning when the students have the ability to interpret the feedback and actually act upon that feedback, because the power of feedback depends on the student's ability to recognize what quality looks like. Yeah.
So this conversation is really not about making self-assessment smaller. It's about making it bigger.
Right.
It's not just the exit slip, the reflection, the checklist once everything's done. We're realizing in the research, but also in the field, that it's teachable, it's valuable, it's so sophisticated, and it is the ultimate manifestation of the real world. And the more that we talk about this, the more I'm coming to realize that self-assessment isn't just a strategy. This is literally a long-term developmental process that we are just beginning in the K-12 years.
So the important point is that students develop evaluative judgment when they regularly study what quality looks like, exemplars, comparisons, discussions, critique, calibration with classmates, etc. The goal isn't just to give students better criteria. The goal is to help students see quality more clearly. So as we've been talking throughout this episode, we hope this conversation feels more encouraging than overwhelming.
I agree, because I don't think the takeaway is that we've been doing self-assessment wrong, and I hope no one's feeling that. I think the takeaway is that self-assessment is just more complex than many of us realized.
And that realization actually explains a lot. It explains why students sometimes struggle to use feedback. It explains why revisions can often feel superficial, and it explains why students often have difficulty accurately judging their own work.
Because what we've really been talking about isn't a strategy. We've been talking about a literacy,
right?
A capability, something that develops over time.
Okay. So we want to think about, as we finish up here, students can't, just a few things to remind yourselves of, listeners. Students cannot independently improve what they cannot independently recognize, right? Independence becomes much more realistic when students can accurately recognize quality.
And this matters so far beyond just school assessment.
Yeah.
This isn't just about grades. This impacts each person's lifelong ability to revise, to accept and use feedback, to set goals, to be self-regulated and motivated, to show true grounded confidence, not false confidence, and ultimately take ownership over their life. And this is huge. This evaluative judgment sits underneath many of the things that we all say we value in life and what we want from it. So the more I think about it, the more I believe evaluative judgment is hiding underneath almost every learner competency that we say we care about.
Right. Teachers spend an enormous amount of time giving kids feedback, but what happens if the students don't fully understand the feedback, right? Feedback starts to become vague, confusing, overwhelming, because the value of feedback is ultimately tied directly to a student's ability to understand, again, what quality looks like.
Which is directly connected to revision, because why do some students sometimes make superficial revisions?
Yeah.
Because they don't know what meaningful improvement looks like.
Exactly.
So they start just adding more words, changing formatting, fixing errors, but students revise differently when they understand quality.
So let's finish off with some just quick summary reminders for everyone.
Yeah. Okay. Self-assessment is not a form, a checklist, or a reflection sheet.
Right. It's a gradual development of evaluative judgment, the ability to recognize quality and understand quality and act on that understanding.
And if we want students to become independent learners, which we do, we may need to spend less time asking them to judge their work and more time teaching them how to see it. Okay, that's it for this week. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of Assess That.
And don't forget to follow Assess That on Instagram. We've got a link in the show notes for that.
And if you have any specific topics that you'd like us to talk about, you can DM us there as well.
And reminder to check the show notes for the upcoming professional learning events next school year. We mentioned those in the opening.
Again, please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast, as it really helps us to grow the podcast's reach.
And finally, if you like what you're hearing, please keep spreading the word about the podcast to your friends, your colleagues, or on social media. We would really appreciate that.
Remember, assessment isn't just a tool, it's a conversation.
And together, we're here to make it a better one.
See you in 2 weeks, everyone.